I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement here at JTS, and it's my pleasure to invite you to today's session of our fall series, 6 Days Shall You Labor, Perspectives on Work in Jewish Text and Tradition. Special welcome to anyone joining us for the first time today, and of course, welcome to all returnees. We apologize for starting our Zoom a little bit late today. We had a perfectly timed fire alarm here at JTS, so everyone connected to this webinar was outside on Broadway, and then we climbed 9 flights to be with you. So we're very happy to be learning with you at this very moment instead of being outside. And we're so pleased to be welcoming our teacher, Rabbi Eliezer Diamond, today. His session is actually different from what I announced last week. It's entitled How to Make Work Meaningful for Us, Exploring the Value of Work in Biblical and Rabbinic Sources. So I'm very much looking forward to it, Rabbi Diamond. Thanks for being with us. And we also really want to thank our sponsors for today, Lori and Michael Gilman, who are sponsoring today's session at the Navi level. That's our highest level for 1,800. Thank you so much to the Gilmans. And anyone else, if you're feeling inspired to sponsor a session with JTS's outstanding faculty, we invite you to consider partnering with us in that way. We have 3 sponsorship levels, Chacham, Sadiq, and Navi for $540, $1,000, and $1,800 respectively. And you can contact Learning Lives at jtsa.edu to learn more. And one more announcement before I turn it over to Tani. We just want to call your attention to a program coming up next week, Wednesday, I think that's next week, Wednesday, December 1st, which is called Fourth Day of Light, JTS Day of Learning and Giving, 2021. We've done this a couple of times already. It's a wonderful day full of learning. We'll have 4 different sessions with JTS scholars, and it'll be an opportunity to gain new insights on Hanukkah from a variety of perspectives, and hopefully you'll also feel inspired to support JTS's mission of creating outstanding leaders for the Jewish future as you enjoy each of those very rich learning sessions. We'll put more information on that in the chat. And on that note, Tani, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. So just to review how we do our Q&A at these sessions, Rabbi Diamond will pause for questions periodically throughout the session. We'll also have time for Q&A at the end. Please chat your questions to Rabbi Julia Andelman. She will select a few questions to present to Rabbi Diamond. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with either myself or Lynn Feinman. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received with the Zoom link for the session. We'll be screen sharing them as well. So pleased to introduce Rabbi Eliezer Diamond, the Rabbi Judah Nadich Associate Professor of Talmud and Rabbinics at JTS. Dr. Diamond has written on prayer, asceticism, and issues of environmental law and ethics. He is currently editing a commentary on the Jerusalem Talmud written by the late Professor Louis Ginsburg, as well as a book on prayer, which will offer readings of traditional liturgy, which help to find meaning and relevance in these prayers for the modern Jew. Rabbi Diamond has been a regular in the series, and we're so lucky to have him teaching for us today.
So that was my cue. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. And I'll say in advance, so in case I forget, wish everyone in advance a happy Thanksgiving and also Chanukah Sameach. So also, I just want to clarify, behind me are not prison bars. That's the windows in my office. I'm at perfect liberty to leave this room at any time. Okay, so Rabbi Andelman alluded to the fact that the title is different from what she had announced because you're asked to give a title and a description, and you do, and then when you sit down to think through things, sometimes you realize you want to go in a slightly different direction. So the fault is mine, not anyone else's. Okay, so let's actually screen share. Okay, it says it's disabled, Tani.
Rabbi Diamond, I just enabled it for you, so it should be okay.
Okay. All right, share. Whoops. Okay, here we go. So I'm a professor and a teacher at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. And most of the time, I feel at one with my profession. I feel that it's one of the reasons that I was put on this earth, one of the missions that I was given to teach and to spread knowledge and wisdom. And that's how most days go. And then there are the other days. You know, I'm sitting and writing or trying to write something, and it just isn't going. I've got one sentence and I can't figure out what the next one is, or I think that what I'm writing is no good, or I feel incapable of writing what I was supposed to write. And in teaching, most of the time, the students and I are in harmony and have a very good feeling about the class. And then sometimes I look out at the students and I see boredom or frustration, and I'm not quite sure how to right the ship. So I mention this because I'm guessing that all of us, in whatever our profession may be, have experienced both kinds of moments. Hopefully, the vast majority of the moments have been of type A, but almost inevitably of type B. And if we look at verses at the very beginning of Genesis, I think that these two faces of work are spelled out for us. So in Genesis 2:15, source number 1, the Lord God took the man and placed him in the Garden of Eden to till it and tend it, as it's sometimes translated. So in other words, that means that Adam and presumably Chava were made apprentices by God in preserving the world as well as developing it further, right? L'shomra is to preserve it, and l'ovda is to work it, to develop it. And that sounds like Adam and Chava are very much in tune with God and with the earth, and that whatever work they're doing feels part of their lives in a way that is positive. And then comes the expulsion, and Adam and Chava are chased out of Gan Eden, Garden of Eden, and God, of course, curses the snake and Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve. And to Adam he said, because you did as your wife said, and ate of the tree which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed be the ground because of you. By toil shall you eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles shall it sprout for you, but your fruit shall be the grasses of the field. By the sweat of your brow shall you get bread to eat, until you return to the ground, for from it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you shall return. So leaving for aside at this time the conclusion of the verse, suddenly, now that Adam and Chava have been expelled from the garden, the earth has become their enemy, not their partner in creating growth, but rather an enemy that I have to fight against. I have to somehow, wrest, W-R-E-S-T, what I need and what I want from the ground. And so this is another phase of work where it just feels like every step feels painful, unpleasant. We wish we could go home already. These are two basic phases of work. And again, I think we've all experienced both. So now I want to take a look at some biblical and rabbinic reflections on work, both realistic and aspirational, and the extent to which they mirror our own experiences and the extent to which they can give us some hope and insight to the degree that we find our work to be a burden. So we're looking at source number 3, which quotes one of the verses from the commandment to observe the Shabbat in the 10 Commandments. It's the 4th commandment. Sheshet yamim ta'avod v'asita kol melachtecha. 6 days you shall labor, you shall do all of your work. How do we understand this verse? So Beit Hillel says it means 6 days you shall work all 6 days. So that means that for Beit Hillel, this verse is not simply descriptive, it's prescriptive. Just as we are supposed to rest on the 7th day, we are supposed to work on 6 days. That's also part of God's command, to be actively engaged in labor, whatever that labor might be. Now, there are different kinds of jobs, and it is, rabbis have definite views about what is a good profession and a bad profession. And it is interesting to see what these are. Many of these professions, donkey driver, camel driver, probably very few of you have taken up those professions. But it's interesting to see. Yeah. So first of all, Rabbi Meir says, a person should always teach his son, parents should teach their children, a clean and easy trade. But also, and pray for success to the one to whom wealth and property belong, as ultimately there is no trade that does not include both poverty and wealth. And I'm going to skip to the next bolded phrase. Poverty does not come from a particular trade, nor does wealth come from a particular trade, but rather all is in accordance with a person's merit. Even if we don't accept that or accept it partially, well, I think that at least part of what they're saying is choosing a profession that promises wealth or high status is not an absolute promise, is not an absolute guarantee that that's what will happen, that we will achieve wealth and high status. But now they go on to describe specific professions. Abba Guria of Tzadyan says, in the name of Abba Guria, a person may not teach his son to be a donkey driver, a camel driver, a pot maker, a sailor, a shepherd, or a storekeeper. And the reason for these is the same, as their trades are the trades of robbers. Their assumption is that when you go into these professions, you're probably going to be deceiving your customers in some way, maybe rationalizing and take something that is not yours. And today also, I don't want to get specific, but there are certain professions where we might see more of this than in other professions. Rabbi Yehuda says in Abba Guria's name, most donkey drivers are wicked since they engage in deceit, and most camel drivers, as opposed to what we saw above, who traverse dangerous places such as deserts, are a fit character as they pray to God to protect them on their journeys. Right? If we're engaged in a dangerous profession, it might lead us to turn more to God because we feel vulnerable. Same thing with sailors. Most sailors are pious since the great danger of the seas instills in them the fear of heaven. Now, here's one that will startle you, my guess is, unless you already know it, and may still startle you. The best of doctors is to Gehenna, and even the fittest of butchers is a partner of Amalek. Why the best of doctors is to Gehenna? Arguably because doctors were not able to do much in the time of the rabbis, and the sense was that sometimes they did more harm than good, which probably was true. The fittest of butchers is a partner of Amalek. To be that kind of person who makes a profession of killing things, they had certain questions about the personality traits of that person. My grandfather, actually, my father's father, was a shochet. Seemed like a reasonable person to me, but this is what the rabbis say. And then Rabbi Nahorai says, I set aside all the trades in the world, and I teach my son only Torah, as a person partakes of its reward in this world, and the principal reward remains for him in the world to come, which is not true of other professions. Leaving aside that last comment, what is important to understand is that when we talk about work for the rabbis, Torah study is also work. It's an avodah. It's holy work. It's a divine work. But the idea is, today we used to say about women who are in the home, they don't work. And of course, nothing could be farther from the truth. And people finally came around to saying they work in the home. And so the same thing, sometimes people who study Torah all the time, and I don't want to get into religious politics, but the study of Torah is not seen as a profession. For the rabbis, it is a profession, and it requires dedication and integrity and precision. So now that we've done a brief survey of what the rabbis think about different kinds of professions, let's look at what they say in Kiddushin 82b. It is taught in the Tosefta. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi says, there is no trade that disappears from the world. Fortunate is he who sees his parents in an elevated trade. Woe is he who sees his parents in a lowly trade. It is impossible for the world to exist without a perfumer and without a tanner. Fortunate is he whose trade is as a perfumer, and woe is he whose trade is as a tanner. So I ask myself, why is that? Now, at some level, I guess the answer is obvious, because if you're a perfumer, you're around pleasant odors all of the time. If you're a tanner, if you've ever been near a tannery, the odor is overwhelming and not pleasant. And it also means that people are not necessarily going to want to hang around with you. One of the grounds for a woman coming to the courts and saying she wants her husband to divorce her is if he becomes a tanner. But there's another element here, which leads to the woe is he whose trade is as a tanner. And it's very important to recognize this. And I think it's something that can be very destructive. Society makes a judgment about the worth of various professions. So yeah, we understand for the person oneself who's become a tanner, that it's malodorous work, difficult work, not necessarily that person's first choice. But part of the woe is that this society decides that this is not a worthy profession. This is a low status profession. And I want to push back and say, That's a societal decision, which we often internalize. I once got a lift from a friend of my mother's first cousin, and he asked me what I do. I said, well, I'm a professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary. He says, oh, you're one of those people who copies over what other people have already written. Okay, but that shows where I stood in his value system, not very high. So it's important for us to think about that for ourselves, but also for others. What are we assuming about certain professions that the world needs? And without them, the world would be poorer for it. And yet we decide to give a negative status or a low status to that profession. Something to think about. So now I want to talk about, so what makes work bad? What makes work bad? So in a sense, I've already addressed that a little bit, that when we are not valued for our work, when we are seen as less than because of the particular work that we do, that can certainly be a source of frustration, negative feelings about the self. But both the Torah and the rabbis use as their model for work that is oppressive the enslavement in Egypt. And the phrase that is used at the beginning of Exodus is avodat perech, which sometimes is translated as back-breaking work. So what is back-breaking work? So in Leviticus, we're told, if a kinsman under you continues in straits and must give himself over to you, do not subject him to the treatment of a slave. He shall remain with you as a hired or bound laborer. He shall serve you only until the Jubilee year. And I think what we're talking about here, that there's a difference between being a hired hand and a slave. So what is true of a slave? A slave has no time of one's own. A slave can be given any amount of work that the master, the owner, decides is appropriate. That is one form of avodat perech. And at the risk of stating the obvious, we can sometimes experience this in our own work, especially with the advent of email. So when are you allowed not to respond to an email? Is it Friday at 6 o'clock, Saturday night at 10, Sunday at 6 in the morning? In some professions, in many professions, there are no boundaries. I'm expected to answer an email no matter when it arrives and quickly. That is a kind of avodat perech. But the rabbis talk about avodat perech in some other and interesting ways. So in the Talmud in Sota 11b, this verse where it says that Bnei Yisrael were enslaved and they had to do avodat perech, which is translated here as in all their service, wherein they made them serve with rigor. Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani says that Rabbi Yonatan says, the meaning of mefarech is that the Egyptians would exchange the responsibilities of men and women, giving men's work with the women's and the women's work with the men's, requiring everyone to do work to which they were unaccustomed. Leaving aside the gender stereotyping here. To me, part of what is being referred to here is when I have a job and I don't feel competent to do that job. And that can be true of a job as a whole. My grandfather originally actually started rabbinical school at JTS, and then his mother died. His father said, you have to come back, blah, blah, blah. He never went back to school. And he was Shomer Shabbat. So if he became a rabbi, that would work pretty well. But since he didn't, and this is going back when it was very difficult to be Shomer Shabbat, what job did he have? He was a salesman. Now, my grandfather was what I call a Jewish American Yankee. He would never say 3 words if he could say 2. So imagine someone with that personality becoming a salesman. Not promising. And I think a lot of people bought from him more out of respect for who he was, and maybe sometimes pity, than anything else. So sometimes we're trapped in a job for which we feel unprepared or incompetent. That is real avodat perech. Let's look at one more item, and then I think it's time for people to be able to ask some questions. So another kind of avodat perech, according to the rabbis, you shall not rule over him ruthlessly, is translated here. This means that you should not say to him, her, warm this cup, right? This is talking to the master. You don't say to your servant, warm this cup when you did not need it. Cool this cup when you do not need it. And then rabbis go on to say, perhaps you will say falsely, I'm requesting this for myself. You'll say, no, I really do need it. You'll say to the person working for you, behold, this is the matter found in the heart. In other words, you can try to deceive others, but God knows what's in our hearts. As scripture says, you shall revere your God. Behold, regarding all matters found in the heart, it is said, you shall revere your God. We might fool other people, but God knows our true intentions. So here I think the rabbis are referring to another element of work that can be oppressive, which is we don't really see any point to the work that I'm doing. I'm filing papers. And as far as I can tell, no one is going to actually look at those papers in the next 100 years. But that's my job. That's my job. That's what I have to do. So there are times when we've got a kind of job where we just are not finding the meaning in it, and we don't necessarily understand the importance of that job. So this is another kind of beferach. Okay, let's take a break and see if people have questions.
All right. So I haven't gotten many questions in yet, but I have questions as always.
Okay, hit it.
So I mean, these sources are touching on pretty big issues, needless to say, right? Like I'm thinking about the idea that being in the wrong job or a job that doesn't, bring out what you have to offer is right. That source casts it as sort of an expression of cruelty and oppression.
Right.
So right, that has big social policy implications. I'm thinking about all of the immigrants who come here who need to start from scratch and earning credentials. I remember working at a synagogue and was friendly with one of the custodians and found out after a few years that he was Ghanaian and he was an engineer. And here he was like cleaning the floors after us every day. So right, like we're not set up to honor these values. That's some of these values that you're sharing with us in pretty systemic ways.
That's very true. And of course, you're right. And again, I mean, that's true in two ways, or maybe three, right? One is my actual talents are not being appreciated and I'm not getting to use them. And the job that I am given is looked down upon. So it's bad enough that I can't do what I'm really talented at. I have to do something which may be unpleasant or it might even not be good at. And I'm also looked down upon. So I don't have the answer to that. But you're absolutely right to point out that this is not just an individual problem, it's a societal problem. Yeah.
Okay, and I wanted to confirm also that the way you were explaining the source, I think it was in Kiddushin, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, about the tanner and the perfumer. You're saying, is he basically just conceding that the way society values or views certain professions is wrong, right? Like he's noting two professions that are equally essential to society, but we view them differently. Is it to?
So I would like to read it that way. In other words, on the one hand, he's saying we need all of these professions. So I would like to bracket in, therefore, we should appreciate all of these professions. You know, we know during the pandemic, people put signs on their lawns, thanks for being out there so we can be in here. You know, whatever one makes of it, it's certainly reflected an understanding that people who are essential workers, some of those people are people who aren't necessarily paid tremendous amounts of money and who very often are seen as low status because of their jobs. And that sign, at least one of the ways of reading that sign, is to say, now we understand a little bit better how important you are. And we're acknowledging that. Now, how much that has actually influenced our society as a whole. But the rabbis say, Hashmeya le'oznecha ma shepicha omer. Let your ears hear what your mouth says. So if anyone put out such a sign, which my wife and I did, what we should be doing is reading the sign ourselves and seeing what the implications of that sign are, that we're acknowledging something that we often don't acknowledge, that people who do these jobs and people who we take for granted are very necessary, a very important part of life. And that should be a reason to value them and to value what they do. So yes, absolutely.
Right, and we saw the deeming someone an essential worker ended up being a double-edged sword pretty quickly.
Yes, right.
You're so essential, and now you have to put yourself in a situation where you don't feel safe.
Right. So that's why I was hesitating a little bit, because one could say that there's a utilitarian tinge to those signs. You know, thanks for doing all the dangerous work, so we cannot be in danger. Yeah, look, what I can do here is look at individual passages, and they don't develop a whole social theory or policy. And you're right to push me and to say, well, why not? Why can't we extend these and use these to talk about the world, our society at large? And my answer to you is, you're right. You're right. So thank you for pushing us in that direction. Okay. So now, let me just see where we are. Yeah. So I also want to point out, this is really going back a little bit, what the rabbis have to say about the nature of work and the relationship between employer and employee. So in the version of the Aseret HaDibrot in Deuteronomy, let's see, Deuteronomy 5. So we have, but the seventh day is a Shabbat of the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. You, your son, your daughter, your male or female slave, your ox or your ass, or any of your cattle, or the stranger in your settlements, so that your male and female slave may rest as you do, kamocha. And the next line is, remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God freed you from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Shabbat day. Now, there are different readings of the connection between the second verse and what preceded it. But I would like to suggest the following reading, that in this interpretation of Shabbat, what Shabbat is doing, among other things, is making sure that pharaonic oppression is not repeated. It is saying to those who have people in their employ in whatever form, you may not be a pharaoh. You may not tell people to work in accordance with your whims. You have to recognize, it actually goes in two directions. You have to recognize that you, like them, are the servants of God, and so you are bound by this requirement of limiting your work and resting on the Shabbat day. But you're also obligated to make sure that your servants have the same right, the same ability to rest, because all of you, A, because all of you are God's servants, and B, because you may be, hierarchically speaking, in a more advantaged position, but you're not Pharaoh, and you may not become Pharaoh. And you have to give people who work for you the same kinds of consideration that you want for yourself. Okay. Wait, where is, no. Okay, actually, okay, we'll come to that later. So now we've seen a number of reasons or a number of ways in which work can be soul crushing, unfair, we're overworked, it's a job from which we don't have a sense of fulfillment. And at the risk of sounding like a conservative, in other words, going back to Rabbi Andelman's remark, of course, societally, we should pay attention to the ways in which the work that we do and the work that we give people to do is oppressive, is befarach, and think about how we can change that. The direction I want to go in now is to say, what happens if we are stuck in such a job? How can we make that job more meaningful? And what kind of integrity can we find if that is the job in which we find ourselves? So I want to look at the passage in Shabbat 31a. Rava said, after departing from this world, when a person is brought to judgment for the life that one lived in this world, they say to that person, did you conduct business faithfully? And then there are a bunch of other questions. But I think that it's so striking that the first question that the rabbis imagined someone being asked at the gates of heaven, as it were, is, were you an honest person? did you do your work with integrity? And I think that in putting that question first, it is saying both to the worker and to people who observe any given worker that what is, if not most important, but is one of the most important criteria for deciding whether I am a good worker is my integrity and my honesty. And that means no matter what I do, I should be valued if that's the kind of worker that I am, which means that that's true for the individual oneself, and also should be true in the eyes of the people who observe that person. Now, I was once in a cab, and as is too often the case, I waited too late to get a cab to go where I wanted to go. I got in the cab, and I said to the cab driver, this is where I want to go, and really I should be there at blah, blah, blah time. Pretty sure that's impossible, but I'm just telling you, whatever you can do, short of running red lights and anything like that, if you can do your best to get me there at that time or as close to that time as possible. And the cab driver clearly knew the streets of Manhattan like the back of his hand. And he didn't break any traffic laws, and he got me there on time. And as I was getting out of the cab, I said to the cab driver, you are an excellent cab driver. You really know what you're doing. Which I said in part because I don't think many people say that kind of thing to cab drivers. They get in, they tell the driver where to go, they pay the money, and they get out. They don't necessarily pay attention, and they don't necessarily value the work that this person is doing for them. And I wanted to convey, first of all, I felt real gratitude, but I also was conveying the message that no matter what you're doing, you can excel in that particular profession, and we should appreciate it when you do. The Talmud is saying something slightly different, which is that one of the ways we excel is through honesty and integrity. Similarly, we're told in Exodus, with regard to the building of the Mishkan, God inspired Bezalel, who is you can't really say the architect of the Mishkan. God was the architect, but Bezalel actualized it. God inspired Bezalel to cut stones for setting and to carve wood, to work in every kind of designer's craft. And that last phrase is translating the words melechet machshevet. So it really means work that's done with forethought. How am I going to do this work? How am I going to do it in the best possible way? The Talmud in the next passage says, one who absent-mindedly performs forbidden labor on Shabbat is exempt from punishment because the Torah forbade only intentional work, melechet machshevet. And the way I'm translating melechet machshevet, I'm pointing out, is the way the rabbis are understanding those two words in this passage. So I'm going to ask you to listen carefully, because we're going to describe a rabbinic way of thinking, which is going to take a little bit of attention to understand. What constitutes work for the rabbis, or some of them, said that building of the Mishkan is the ultimate form of work. It parallels, and indeed some of the language that describes the building of the Mishkan parallels the language that we find in Genesis 1. In other words, God built the world, and we, following in God's steps, are building, this is the first public works project, as it were, of Bnei Yisrael. And it is being compared to the creation of the world. And therefore, what is not permitted to be done on Shabbat is anything that was deemed malacha in the building of the Mishkan. And what's being said here is true work, true malacha has to be intentional work. If I do work sloppily or lazily or without thinking about the work that I do, that's not true malacha. And that's why on Shabbat, when malacha is forbidden, if the way I do that malacha is lackadaisical or unintentional, that's not malacha. That's not real work. Should we take another break or see if there are questions?
Sure, I do have questions. Okay, so connected to what you were just talking about with, doing our work with honesty and integrity. A few people asked about whether the rabbis value other ways of doing our work that we value today, assuming that a person does their job with integrity, like innovation, creativity, efficiency, productivity, the general quality of their work. Is that something that, are those things that the rabbis are concerned with?
So I'll bracket creativity for a moment. Productivity. So productivity, I want us all to realize, is a tricky word, because in the capitalist way of thinking, productivity can mean the enslavement of workers. So if I'm on the assembly line in a meat packing plant, I may be forced to wear a diaper because we want to be productive. We don't want to waste time with things like going to the restroom. So we're much more productive if you wear a diaper. That is certainly not the kind of productivity that the rabbis would approve of. I think they would approve of, and again, I mean, if we expand what they said before about Sheshet Yamim Tavod Vasita Kol Melachtecha, that this is a mitzvah to work all 6 days, it means I am obligated to be productive. Throughout the week, I am supposed to produce. But I want to make an important distinction. Productivity can describe the ends, or it can describe the means. What I just described before with people wearing diapers is thinking of productivity in terms of the ends. I think the rabbis think about productivity in terms of the means, in terms of me as a productive person. That to be fully human, I should be productive, which could be through my profession and could be in many other ways. If I'm helping other people, that's productive. If I'm spending time with my children, that's productive. So I think that's a very, very important distinction, right, between getting the most we can out of people and personally taking responsibility to contribute as much as we can through our work, whatever that means, and contribute whatever we can to the world. Rabbi Soloveitchik once asked the following question. Of course, it was a rhetorical question because he knew what the answer was going to be for him. The question was, why does the Torah start with Genesis 1? Why is it important for us to read the story of God creating the world? So his particular answer was, it is a model for us and how we should live our lives. We are supposed to walk in God's ways. And one of the ways that we're supposed to do that is by being creative. Now, again, create can mean that I'm productive. It also, in our terms, can mean innovative, insightful. The one area, frankly, where that's emphasized by the rabbis is with regard to Torah study. That in Torah study, I'm not just supposed to study the texts, but I'm supposed to engage them and try to innovate in terms of how the text is understood, to interpret it in a way that extends its meaning. So it seems to me if we transfer that to the work world, that the rabbis, they don't do it, but you don't have to follow them slavishly. We can say that should be a value in our work as well, not just to do it by the numbers, but to say, how can I do it better? Or what can I learn that will help me be a better worker and maybe contribute more? Another question?
Great, thank you. I don't know if you're going to talk about this, but someone asked about, and this relates to what you were just saying as well, about mistreatment by employers, which could happen even in a job that you love. That's the right job. It doesn't need to be one of these sort of misfit jobs that we talked about before.
Right. So there are many, as we know, passages in the Torah, and we've already seen some of them, that are very sensitive to the power imbalance between employer and employee in most situations. So before, the Torah was talking about someone who is in such financial straits that they have no choice but to hire themselves out as a laborer. And that's a perfect situation, again, like the people on the line in the meat packing, right? Where the owner and the employer realizes this person doesn't really have too many options here. So I have the power and I'm going to use this person, and I mean it in both senses of the word, as I need it. And what's the person going to do? What are they going to do? So therefore, the constant emphasis on not to follow the example of the society under which you suffered and were freed from. And you weren't freed in order to recreate that society. You were freed in order to create a different kind of society. I always like to note that in Parshat Mishpatim, which is the Torah portion that follows immediately upon Yitro, where we have the 10 Commandments, right? So Mishpatim is this expansion of the commandments, greater details. What's the first one? If you acquire a Hebrew slave, this is how you should treat that slave. And I've always thought to myself, what I would say to God is, that's really not a good plan. I mean, you talking about I took you out of Egypt, I made you free, and this is what we're starting off with? Hierarchy, power imbalance. And my answer is that it is facing head on the problem of enslavement. There will always be hierarchy in the world. There will always be more powerful people and less powerful people. The Torah is taking that head on. There are going to be situations that are awfully similar to the one that you were in Egypt. You have to turn away. The first thing I'm going to tell you is turn away from the temptation to recreate that kind of society. It works differently here. People are treated with greater respect, are given greater freedom. You can't have someone be your slave or your servant forever, right? 6 years, and then they go free, and so on and so forth. Okay, I think we should go on. We'll have other opportunities for questions. So, yeah. Now we come to something else. And again, I want this to be heard, not, well, I'll say it, and hopefully it will be understood in the way that I mean it. And I may go back if I feel I need to clarify it. Part of the way that work can be, even difficult work or unpleasant work, can be made more pleasant is if we realize, and I alluded to this before, that really we are ultimately working not for our employer. We are working for God, because as it said back in Leviticus, Ki avadai heim, all of us are God's workers. So my way of looking at myself and looking at my work can be to say, yes, there is injustice, and I want to fight against it. But right now, the way I want to see what I'm doing is doing what God asks me and every other person to do, which is, to the best of my ability, do something that helps the world, do it with integrity and honesty. And that is a major contribution to the world, no matter how other people regard me, even when the work is oppressive, and certainly want to fight against that. But since we are sometimes found in that situation, we realize that really in the end, we are working for God. And that should be the measure by which we judge our own value and the success of what we do. And the rabbis say something interesting. Ben Zoma says, who is wealthy? One who rejoices in one's portion. As scripture states, you shall enjoy the fruit of your labors. You shall be fortunate, and it will be good with you. You will be fortunate in this world, and it will be good, should be good with you in the next. So this is sometimes translated as, who is wealthy? One who is satisfied with one's lot. And I don't think that's the appropriate translation. I think that the appropriate translation is to rejoice in one's lot, to find joy in the portion that we have. Rabbi Eliyahu Dessler, in his book Michtav Me'Eliyahu, talks about this passage, about Ashir, and says that sometimes we see wealthy people who have material wealth as being rich, and we see ourselves as being relatively poor. So Rabbi Dessler says, when are we actually poor? We're poor when we feel that we don't have everything that we want. Now, I read an article once, I don't remember if it was in New Yorker, where they asked Manhattanites if they were rich. And they went to people with whatever, $1 million homes, $2 million homes, apartments, with good jobs. And some of them said, actually, I'm not wealthy, because look at that person. He's got a helicopter and he's got whatever, 2 houses, blah, blah, blah. So I'm not really wealthy. Dessler says that person is poor, because that person is always searching after something that one doesn't have. Now, again, I say this with great care. I'm not trying to create a picture of saying, just be happy with what you want. Yeah, there's injustice in the world. That's the way it goes. But what I am saying is, in the face of injustices, we can find ways of finding joy in what we do have. They're not mutually exclusive. We can fight for justice for ourselves and for other people, and at the same time, realize the good that we have in our own lives. I keep a gratitude journal at night. And part of why this is useful is that very often I think I had a bad day. And then I write in the gratitude journal. And different people have different approaches. My approach is I start off by saying, thank you, Hashem, for this day. And then I simply catalog what happened during the day. And what I discover is the bad day, I mean, some days are horrific, but the average bad day is not a bad day. It's a day where some bad things happen, but there were many, many good things as well. And that causes me to rejoice in what is good in my life and really to value it. So again, there's a balance here. And by the way, this question came up before of what the Torah has to say about injustices of the employer. I sort of interrupted myself. Lo talin pu'ulat schar sachir. People should be paid on time, the Torah says. It is forbidden not to pay people on time, which unfortunately is a practice in too many instances. If someone owes you money, you may not enter their house in order to take payment. The sanctity of their dwelling is such that, yes, they may owe you money, but that doesn't entitle you to violate their privacy. Trying to think of other such halachot. Those are some. I'm sure if I could think more, I would think of others. But there's no question that the Torah is very concerned with how an employer treats an employee. Let's see what questions we have now.
Great. So someone was wondering if you could comment on, what some people are calling the Great Resignation that's happening now with so many people quitting their jobs because they're not consistent with a lot of the values that you've been talking about. And I think it connects to the benzoma source, right? Like sometimes you can realize this is not a portion that I'm going to ever rejoice from. It's like Marie Kondo, what sparks joy. This job is never going to spark joy. I'm going to be mistreated. I'm going to be underpaid, and I can do better for myself. And I don't need to live this way. So that's happening, en masse across several sectors. Restaurant and retail workers and childcare and teachers. So yeah, the question was, can you comment on that? Kind of pandemic fueled phenomenon that's going on now.
Right. So, yeah, I think this is a case where we are asking ourselves about the value of the work that we do and what degree of joy it brings or doesn't bring to our lives. And I think it's also a time when we're evaluating what do we want the real work of our lives to be, which can include things like, if I'm supposedly, I care about my children, grandchildren, and my spouse, do my actions match my words? Am I doing that work? Because remember, at least this is what I would say. The most important work that we have in our lives is the construction of ourselves, working on ourselves. Everything else we do is based on that. So I think that's a question that people are asking themselves now. And I would also say, by the way, that the fact that a lot of people are leaving certain jobs seems, at least in some cases, to be leading to people raising the salaries in some of those areas in order to attract those people back. And so part of what's going on is people saying, one of the ways in which I wasn't valued at my job is what I was getting paid. I want to see myself being more valued, among other ways, with getting paid what I should get paid. So yeah, I think that this is an extremely important moment. And again, I think it has to do with the values that we were talking about. Respecting myself, doing something that for me is productive, something in which I feel competent. Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions?
This is sort of a big question, so you can tell me if you want to take it now or later. The question is, we talked about, it connects to what you were just saying, and we also talked earlier about how we can't decide social policy based on these rabbinic sources. But the questioner was asking about, well, what about our Jewish institutions, and where there are gaps between the values in these sources and how we're running our own institutions. So, like I said, that's a big question.
It's a big question, and I want to answer this question carefully and with humility, not least because I work in a Jewish institution, and therefore, to the extent that there are failures in this area, I'm implicated in those. I can't say, the joke about, Rabbi gives a fire and brimstone sermon, and one of the congregants comes up afterwards and says to the rabbi, "You really told those people off." So I don't want to separate myself. I'm implicated. This is how I see it. I think that one of the biggest challenges that we have, a human being has, is we see afar, but we don't see up close. The values that we espouse, whether it's civil rights, gay rights, concern for the oppressed out there, we have trouble, it seems to me, realizing that dealing with these problems has to start at home, including in our institutions. And unfortunately, we know that Jewish institutions, like all institutions, to be fair, do not always live up to these values. But I think what's particularly frustrating to me is that somehow we don't see that that's actually our first obligation before we help the oppressed wherever, people in Israel, homeless. I'm not saying, stop the presses and just work on ourselves. But again, it comes back to what I said before. The most important job, in my estimation, that we have in our lives is to work on ourselves. If we work on ourselves and become the kind of people that we should become, then an overflow of that will be knowing how to expand that to all the people around me who need justice, who need compassion, who need whatever it is. So I think that Jewish institutions should say to themselves, the Torah speaks to all of us, including us. And before we have the right to demand justice and compassion in the world at large, we have to be living that in our own lives, in our own institutions. Exactly what that means and the complications of, limited funds, blah, blah, blah. I'm not trying to say it from on high, but I think it has to be said. And I think to the extent that we can, we have to hold our institutions' feet to the fire and saying, where are the values that you espouse being realized in the institution itself? That's an important question. It's an important challenge.
Amen.
I'm really open to answering questions at this point.
Okay, you
Yeah,
want to go through any more?
no, those are the sources that I've prepared. So if you ask me good questions, I'll be able to, give you more Torah, as it were. I ask questions. Good.
Okay, I've asked you most of what has come in, and I just want to explain to some people who are asking questions in the chat. I'm not sharing with Rabbi Diamond. There are a whole category of questions that we really addressed in last week's session with Dr. Rosenthal about work-life balance and wealth. So I'm just for the sake of those who were at that session, I'm going to not raise those and kind of refer you back to the recording of last week's session. And Rabbi Diamond, if you want to go ahead and stop your screen share, we can see you better.
Okay. So there is another area that I want to address. I mean, one of my points is that we have to be maximalists in terms of how we define work. As I say, work begins with ourselves, but in every relationship, we have a job. And just as we have to do a good job at our place of work, we also have to do a good job in our homes and with our families. So the same way, and this is obvious, but I'll say it, the same way that we can identify a boss as being oppressive, to the extent that we are bosses, let's say relative to our children or partners relative to a spouse, we should be measuring, and I'm speaking first and foremost to myself, we should be measuring whether we are using the same standards in that relationship that we expect to be used in our workplace. Because it's very easy for us to treat our children, for example, as employees. They're our kids, so we tell them what to do. And after all, they are our kids. So we can tell them whatever we want, and they should be doing what we want. Obviously, that's oppressive. And there are other ways in which we can be oppressive, not valuing or downgrading the work of our children, whether it's what they do in school, what their hobbies are. This is part of their life work. And we need to have the ability to value it. Maybe it's not something that we would do. And maybe in our minds, we would rather they do something else. But one of the most painful words that children can hear from a parent is, "I'm disappointed in you." And that is really sort of a very basic devaluing of my child. And the same thing in relationships between spouses, for example. It's work. I don't mean that I should, get into bed thinking, "Oh my God, this is so much work being married." I don't mean it in that sense. But I mean the same integrity that we are told to have in our work, life, we need to have in our relationships. Am I being fully mindful and giving my spouse my full attention? Do I tell my spouse often enough that I love him or whoever? Okay. This is part of the work of being in a relationship. It's work. It's not like extra credit. This is part of our life work. So I think, applying these same values and principles at home. And it's really the same kind of thing that we were talking about before, about institutions. You know, families are also institutions. And if we help, I mean, just to take an example, and this is especially for people in helping professions, sometimes we will get so involved in the work of helping others that we forget that our primary obligation is to the people in our own household. So there is a balance, but the moment that I start thinking it's more important to help other people than it is to care for the people in my household, I'm going down a very dangerous path. And I think the Torah would say a wrong path. That's not the path we should be going down.
Part of me wants to end on that note, but a pretty interesting curveball has come in. Are you up for it?
Yeah, let's see. I got my mid up. Yeah, go ahead.
All right, I'm going to abstract it a little bit from the way the person phrased it, but I think the question is about, this person mentions the oldest profession, which I'm saying euphemistically because I know at least one person who sometimes listens to recordings of our sessions with kids around. Right, people for various reasons might go down professional paths that, including, you know, people that we love and care about, that we find very problematic. Not that everyone finds that profession problematic, and there are all kinds of movements for rights in that profession. But you know, we can think of other examples too. I don't know how if you think there's something to pull from the sources on, you know, when you feel that when someone sort of goes off the path professionally.
Well, I think we have to distinguish between people with power and people without power or very little power. People with power can sometimes be in a position where they are rapacious, manipulative. I mean, to take extreme example, you have money, you have people invest money with you and you defraud them. That is an evil act. I mean, that's an extreme, but I do think we have the right to say I mean, it's hard to say, but if someone is working for a company where it's clear to us, I'm willing to be educated, but it's clear to us that it is a company that is dishonest, rapacious, whatever it may be, we can say to a friend, you should think about it, or have you thought about it? Have you thought about the fact that by working at this company, you're implicated in the wrongdoings of this company? I think I have at least the obligation to think about it. But here we come to the second thing that I said, which is the difference between being in a position of power and not being in a position of power. And so, for example, I mean, again, to take the case that you started with, why do I enter that particular profession? One of the reasons that I enter it is because I haven't been provided with opportunities by my family or by my society to do something else. So it certainly would be a mistake to say to that person, you have to stop doing what you're doing because it's wrong. I think our obligation is to find the roots of that decision and to say, how can we change the picture? How can we give the person the help and the support that will allow this person to find a different way of making a living? You know, if Chaim Brisker, a rabbi in the late 19th and early 20th century, first of all, he once said, he was asked, what is the main job of the rabbi? And his answer was to protect the powerless. And I just love that line, because that's not usually what you're going to hear. But I very much identify with it, that if I'm a person who's given power, my primary job, or one of my primary jobs, is to tend to the people who don't have power. That's why I was given power, to do exactly that. And there's a story told about him that there was a young woman who became pregnant, was not married, and she was shunned by the community and was living at the periphery of the town. And Rav Chaim said to people, said to a number of people, or maybe community leaders, so what's happening with this woman? And they said, well, she's a sinner, so we're really not involved with her. And basically Rav Chaim said, that may be, and she still is a human being. So we can have whatever opinion we have about that life decision that she made, but that doesn't mean she forfeits her right to ask and really demand our caring and our compassion. Yeah.
Thank you. So I think true to your love of Musar, where you always bring us back, whatever you come to teach us on. I think one of my big takeaways from this session is, I don't know if other people went in this direction. I could not help thinking of what they say on an airplane. Put your own mask on before your child's. You were talking about care and cultivation of the self, as it has to start there in order for things to for that good and moral orientation to flow out into our families and society and community, society, the world. So I really appreciate that teaching, and I just wanted to share also a comment that someone just shared about how the opposite can happen so easily, right? If we're subject to or cultivating a toxic or even just unappreciative kind of work environment, right? Then we're propagating that too can flow outwards from us. So it really behooves us to do what you're talking about, if for no other reason than preventatively.
I would agree. And I want to fine tune something that you said. On one level, I accept the analogy of put on your own mask first before. So that really is about, taking care of yourself. If you're not going to be able to help someone else if you don't take care of yourself. But I want to go a little further and say that the obligation of gemilut chasadim begins with the self. I have to be kind with and supportive of myself. That's the first person with whom I have to exercise gemilut chasadim. There's a Mishnah that says, Chayav Adam Lomar, Bishvili Nivra Ha'olam. Every person is obligated to say, the world was created for me. And one of the Musar Sfarim says, obviously, it's not suggesting a myopic or totally self-centered view, like the world was created for me, for you, I don't know. But rather, each person says this. So what I realize is, just as the world, it would have been enough to create the world just for me. When I look around, I realize that that's true of every other person too. And what that says is that God has unconditional love for us. Just at the moment where we have a child, we don't immediately think, well, what school are they going to start taking inventory, although maybe some parents might slip into that, but right, what we're being told is whoever we are, whatever we are worthy of being created. God, in an act of love, allowed us to come into the world. So we have to extend that to self-valuation, and we have to extend it to the people around us. So we may disagree, we may have trouble with what they're doing, and they are still people for whom it would have been enough for the world to be created. And especially when we're looking at members of our own family, to at some level, I once said to my children, I got them together and I said, this is something that you need to know. And I think kids know it, but I wanted to say it in so many words. No matter what you do, I will love you. Might be angry, I might have other emotions, but my love will remain because you're deserving of that love simply because you are my child. And the Mishnah is saying that that is God's relationship with every human being. Every human being is deserving of God's love. I understand there are certain cases where that can get complicated, but as C.S. Lewis once said about his book in Forgiveness, let's not start with the Nazis. Let's start with the average range of human beings. Every person is loved in that God, in the greatest act of love possible, brought them into the world. So that's how we have to see ourselves, I think. And that's how we should see our family members. That's how we should see others. And to circle back to the topic of this, that's part of our work. That's a key avodah, a key labor that should be at the center of our lives.
We can't end on a more beautiful note than that. And I know that everyone here knows why I felt so lucky in rabbinical school to have Rabbi Diamond as my teacher and rabbi. Thank you so much for teaching us today. Thank you to everyone for coming. Thank you so much to our sponsors of today's session. Once again, the Gilmans, for your generosity. And hope to see all of you next week. We have our alum, Dr. Tamar Marvin, coming to teach a session on Maimonides, who we talked about a little bit in our session with Dr. Jonathan Ray on medieval professions. We will delve deeper into the life and profession of a well-known, or we think well-known figure. In the meantime, as Rabbi Diamond said, we wish everyone a very happy Thanksgiving, and we look forward to learning with you again on the other side. Thanks again, Rabbi Diamond.
Amen. Thank you. Everyone have a great day.